Hello, lovely people. I was going through some submitted scripts this week, and this one stopped me cold. Not because of the betrayal itself, but because of the way that used to overcome it. A copyright registration timestamp. Filed at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. That one move rewrote everything. You're watching Eternal Diary. The smell of dried ink is specific. It is not the clean, abstract scent people imagine when they picture a calligraphy studio. It is older than that. More organic. A faint mineral bitterness underneath something that is almost sweet. The way old paper smells when it has absorbed years of human breath and patience. Shenqing had grown up with that smell embedded in the back of her throat, in the fold of every memory she considered real. She was 7 the first time her grandfather pressed a wolf hair brush into her palm and told her that the wrist must be a river, not a stone. She was 11 when she copied the Heart Sutra for the first time without a single correction. She was 19 when she began taking commissions, small ones at first, calligraphy for wedding invitations, for memorial stones, for framed poetry gifts at retirement parties. Nothing that would have made anyone rich. Nothing that would have made anyone notice her. Her sister, Shen Rui, had never once picked up a brush with intent. Shen Rui's hands were made for other things, for scrolling through contacts, for typing messages at inhuman speed, for gesturing broadly at dinner tables when she needed to illustrate the size of her ambitions. Shen Rui was the kind of person who made rooms feel smaller the moment she entered. Not because she was physically imposing, but because she operated at a frequency that demanded acknowledgement. Their mother had called it charisma. Their father had called it hunger. Shenqing had spent most of her adult life calling it exhausting. When Shenqing died at 31, a fact she now carried in her chest like a piece of glass she had swallowed and simply learned to breathe around, she died in a studio apartment that smelled of nothing. No ink, no paper. The walls were bare. The brushes she had kept through everything, even the lean years, were gone. Sold. She had sold them to cover medical bills after a minor accident became complicated by neglect, by being too poor to follow up on treatment, by being the kind of person the hospital system processed and had moved past quickly. The commission had been the reason for all of it. 800,000 yin. That was what Hantian Cultural Heritage Foundation had been prepared to pay for a series of 36 original calligraphy scrolls. Works based on classical Tang poetry, formatted for permanent display in the new wing of a national cultural museum. A project that had taken Hantian's director Fang Wei nearly 4 years to fund and receive approval for. He had found Shenqing through a contact, through a professor at a fine arts institution who had kept 3 of her practice sheets pinned above his own desk for 6 years. He had called her studio number in March, spoken to her for 40 minutes about the vision, and agreed to a follow-up meeting in 2 weeks. Shen Rui had answered the phone during that follow-up call. Shenqing had been in the bathroom. 3 minutes. She had been in the bathroom for 3 minutes, and in that time her sister, who had been visiting under the pretense of borrowing a pair of boots, had seen the number on the caller ID, seen Hantian Cultural Heritage Foundation, and made a calculation so fast and so cold it would have impressed Shenqing if she had known about it in time. By the time Shenqing walked back into the room, the call was over. Shen Rui was handing the phone back with a breezy expression that Shenqing in her first life had read entirely wrong. "Wrong number," Shen Rui said. Some survey thing? She had no idea. She waited 2 more weeks for director Fang Wei to call again. He did not. She assumed the project had fallen through. She had learned not to count on things. What she did not know, what she spent 3 years piecing together, from overheard conversations and social media posts, and finally a phone call with a journalist friend who had attended the museum's opening exhibition, was that Shen Rui had called director Fang Wei back. He introduced herself as Shenqing's representative and business partner, arranged a meeting, and arrived at that meeting with a portfolio of Shenqing's work. Her own work, the pieces she had photographed during years of watching her sister practice. She had presented it as hers. She had signed a contract worth 800,000 yuan to produce 36 scrolls of Tang Dynasty classical poetry calligraphy. She had then hired 2 graduate students from a calligraphy program in another city. She'd shown them samples of Shenqing's style and paid them each 15,000 yuan to produce rough drafts. She had corrected those drafts herself with a borrowed brush, and the confidence of someone who had never once in her life believed that competence was a prerequisite for authority. The final scrolls were not good. They were not Shenqing. They were close enough that a person who did not know the difference might not immediately notice, and Shen Rui had understood. With the animal precision of someone who had spent her whole life operating in the space between close enough and real that most people do not know the difference. The scrolls were delivered. They were accepted. The museum wing opened, and Shenqing, who had no idea any of this had happened, had continued taking small commissions, birthday cards, shop signs, a single poem for a couple's anniversary, at prices that barely covered her brushes. To wondering why the trajectory of her work had never seemed to lift the way her professor had always suggested it would. She died at 31, a small, practical death. Unremarkable. Then she woke up. She was 26 again, and the first thing she smelled was ink. The sensation of consciousness returning to a body 5 years younger is not the cinematic experience that the word rebirth suggests. There is no golden light. There is no swelling awareness of restored possibility. There is instead the specific confusion of inhabiting a space you remember but no longer match, like putting on a coat you wore in childhood and finding it fits. Her hands were smoother. Her back did not ache. The familiar stiffness in her right wrist, a chronic complaint from a decade of improper grip technique before her professor corrected it, was simply gone. She was lying on the floor of her studio. She had fallen asleep at her desk, which had happened before, and slid sideways onto the narrow strip of floor between the desk and the wall. She was 26. It was a Tuesday in February, and through the single east-facing window, the sky was doing the specific gray-pink thing it did in early morning when snow had fallen overnight, but the sun was attempting the day anyway. Her phone was on the desk above her. She reached up and took it without standing. She knew the date without checking because she knew what Tuesday in February meant. She had spent 3 years obsessing over the timeline of her loss, reconstructing it the way investigators reconstruct accidents, measuring angles and speeds and the precise moment when something preventable became catastrophic. Director Feng Wei's follow-up call was in 6 days. Shen Rui's visit, the boots, the bathroom, the 3 minutes, was in 5. She lay on the floor for a long time. The studio was the same. The walls held the same works in progress, a half-finished commission for a tea house, 3 practice sheets where she had been working on a particularly difficult character from the 1,000-character classic, a small mounted piece of her grandfather's favorite Li-Bai poem that she had been planning to give him for his birthday. The smell was the same. The cheap electric kettle on the small shelf was the same, its red power light blinking because she had left it on. She stood up slowly. Her joints did not crack. 26. She made tea in a cup that had a faint chip at the rim she had stopped noticing years ago. She sat on the low stool she used when she was thinking rather than working. A different posture, a different kind of stillness. She drank the tea. She looked at the window. The glass in her chest that she had swallowed, that dense, settled weight of knowing exactly how this had ended, was still there. It was not going anywhere, but she understood. With the clarity of someone who has had their anger age for 3 years inside a body that no longer exists, that clarity is its own kind of resource. She did not feel rage. She felt something quieter and more sustainable than rage. She felt precise. The problem with most people who are wronged is that they want acknowledgement. They want the person who hurt them to understand what they did, to feel the proportional weight of it, to arrive at some moment of reckoning that mirrors the internal experience of the victim. Shenqing had wanted that too in her first life, in the years after she gradually understood what had been taken from her. She had fantasized about confrontations, about arriving at her sister with evidence, with witnesses, with the full architecture of proof laid out like a prosecution. But she had died before she could construct it, and lying on the floor of her studio at 26, reborn, or she understood something her first life had not given her time to learn. Acknowledgement is a terrible goal. Acknowledgement is personal. It is emotional. It requires the other person's participation, and people who are capable of what Shen Rui had done are also capable of not participating when it matters. What Shenqing wanted now was not acknowledgement. She wanted remedy. There is a specific provision in China's copyright law, Article 10, that outlines the rights belonging to the author of a work. The right of publication, the right of authorship, the right of revision, the right of integrity, and critically, the right of exploitation. These rights belong to the creator of the work. not the person who transports it, not the person who presents it, not the person who signs a contract claiming to be its creator. The copyright exists the moment the work is created, and in a dispute, the question of who created the work is a question of evidence. Evidence, Shunting now understood, was a question of timestamp. She had spent the last 3 years of her first life, after the journalist friend's phone call, after the slow devastation of understanding, doing what grieving people often do with information they cannot use. She had researched it obsessively. She had read the copyright law the way other people read scripture, not devotionally, but forensically. So looking for the specific sentence that explained her specific loss, she had found it. She had found the entire framework. She had found the precedents, the procedure for initiating an administrative complaint versus a civil lawsuit, the role of the Copyright Protection Center of China in maintaining registration records, the way courts weighed original work materials, preliminary sketches, dated practice sheets, the digital photographs of works in progress, against the testimony of parties with competing claims. She had learned all of it too late to use it. She was not going to make that mistake again. On the morning of her first day back, before she touched a single brush, she did 3 things. The first was to gather every work-in-progress piece in her studio and photograph each one with her phone, making sure the EXIF data was intact, date, time, location embedded in every file. Then she uploaded those files to 2 cloud storage services and 1 external drive, documenting the upload timestamps. The second thing she did was go to the China Copyright Protection Center's online portal and begin the process of initiating voluntary registration for her existing portfolio. Not all of it. The significant pieces, the ones she considered representative of her style, the distinctive brushwork variations that made her work identifiable to anyone trained to look. This process would take days to complete, but starting it mattered. Beginning it mattered. The initiation timestamp mattered. The third thing she did was call her grandfather. He answered on the second ring, the way he always did, with the direct and unhurried manner of someone who had decided decades ago that unnecessary preamble was a form of disrespect. "Ching," he said. Not a greeting. An identification, a welcome. "Grandfather." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I want to come see you this week. I need to record the full collection." A pause. He understood what she meant. He had watched her work for 19 years. He understood the word record in the context she was using it, the careful documentation of process, the kind of evidence that demonstrated not just what a finished work looked like, but how it was built, stroke by stroke, decision by decision. The kind of thing that could not be faked by someone who had only ever photographed completed pieces. "Come Thursday," he said. "I'll have the light on." She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her lap. In 5 days, Shenrui would arrive with the pretense of the boots. The thing about a trap, a real trap, not the dramatic kind, not the confrontational cinematic version, is that the best ones do not look like traps at all. They look like nothing. They look like Tuesday. They look like a person continuing their ordinary life while an invisible architecture assembles itself in the background, stone by careful stone, until the weight of it becomes structural and then permanent. Shenqing did not plan to stop Shenrui from taking the call. She was going to let it happen. This required a particular kind of self-control that she had not possessed at 26 in her first life, and which she was not entirely certain she possessed now at 26 in her second. The anger was still there. It was not gone. It had simply been filed carefully, the way she filed her best brushes. Not discarded, not in use, stored correctly so that when the time came, the edge would still be there. She spent the next 4 days working. She worked in a state of deliberate documentation. She set up her phone on a small stand in the corner of her studio, running video during her longest practice sessions. Not because she needed the footage for artistic purposes, but because a video file of a person producing work, time-stamped, is the kind of evidence that has a specific legal weight in a copyright dispute. She completed 3 pieces she had been developing in early drafts, and registered each one with the Copyright Protection Center the moment the ink dried, and she could photograph them in full. She wrote detailed notes in a physical journal, the kind of notes an artist makes naturally, observations about inconsistency, decisions about character spacing, reasons for choosing one rendering of a character over another. And she dated every entry with the specificity that looked, to anyone reading over her shoulder, like simple habit, but was in fact the habit of someone constructing a paper trail. She was building a clock, a precise, unassailable clock of authorship. On Thursday, she went to her grandfather's house. He lived in the kind of apartment that accumulates decades rather than displaying them. Books layered against every flat surface, hanging scrolls that had darkened with age, a wooden desk so saturated with ink it had developed its own weather. He was 78 and had the physical economy of someone who had never wasted a gesture in his life. He watched her set up her phone on a borrowed stand with the expression of a man who was asking a question he was choosing not to voice. "I'm going to explain later," she said. "You don't need to explain," he said. "Work." She worked for 6 hours. He sat in his chair and watched, occasionally making a sound that was not approval exactly, but was the sound he made when something she did was correct. She produced 7 finished pieces, 3 entirely new. 4 that she had begun before and completed today. She photographed each one in sequence, annotated each photograph with the date and a handwritten label she held next to the work, the kind of casual documentation that looked unrehearsed precisely because it was so specific. Before she left, he asked her once, quietly, whether she was in trouble. "Not anymore," she said. He nodded once and did not ask again. She drove home in the early dark, the city flicking past the car window in the particular way winter cities have. All amber and blue, all the warmth behind glass. She did not feel nervous. She felt the way she felt before beginning a complex character. The specific stillness of readiness, the body knowing what the mind has already decided. Shenrui arrived on Saturday. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon, which Shenqing remembered exactly, and she was wearing the same green jacket she had been wearing that first time. And she brought a container of the sweet fermented rice their mother made, which Shenqing also remembered, because the sweetness of it had been the specific cruelty of the memory. Her sister bringing food, bringing warmth, filling the studio with her presence in the way she always did, while simultaneously performing the most precise theft of Shenqing's professional future. "I was in the neighborhood," Shenrui said, setting the container on the low shelf. "You're never just in the neighborhood," Shenqing said. "You plan things." Shenrui laughed. It was a good laugh, genuine sounding, the laugh of someone who had never once considered that being a planner was anything but a compliment. "The boots," she said. "Can I grab those?" "They're in the closet." Shenrui disappeared into the closet alcove off the studio entrance. Shenqing sat at her desk and continued working. Her phone was on the desk. She was aware of it the way she was aware of weather. Peripherally, with the steady attention of something she had already accounted for. Director Fang Wei's number was not in her contacts under his name. In her first life it had been. She had added it after their initial call. She had put his name in carefully, the way she added names of people who mattered professionally. In this life, she had left it as the number string, unlabeled, because she understood now that the label was what had gotten her caught. She heard Shenrui come back out of the closet with the boots. She heard her set them down. She heard the pause, the specific quality of a pause that belongs to someone who has spotted something and is deciding how to act on it. The phone rang. Shenqing looked at the screen. The unlabeled number. She picked it up on the 3rd ring. "This is Shenqing." "Ah," Director Fang Wei's voice, the measured, the slightly formal tone of a man who was used to speaking carefully in professional contexts. "Miss Shen, this is Fang Wei from Hantian Cultural Heritage Foundation. I apologize for calling slightly earlier than we arranged. Are you available to speak?" "Absolutely," she said. She did not look at her sister. She could feel Shenrui's attention land on her back like a hand pressing between her shoulder blades. "I was just working. Please go ahead." Shenrui picked up her boots and left. Shenqing watched her close the door and spoke with Director Fang Wei for 58 minutes. She was meticulous and specific. She described her style history, her training under her grandfather, the specific ways her brushwork had developed over the past decade. She explained her approach to Tang poetry specifically, her belief that classical works required a particular kind of interpretive restraint, that the calligrapher's role was not to impose personality onto the text, but to open a channel through which the text could move at its original weight. She described in considerable technical detail the sequence in which she would approach 36 scrolls, the progression from shorter poems to longer, from simpler to more complex structural demands. Director Fang Wei was quiet for much of this, and in the attentive quiet of someone absorbing rather than waiting to speak. When she finished, he said, "I would like to visit your studio next week if you are willing. I've seen photographs, but..." A brief pause. "I prefer to see a person work." "Come any morning," she said. "I start at 7. After she hung up, she sat for a moment in the stillness of what she had just done. She had not stopped her sister. She had not tried to intercept or warn or protect herself in the obvious way. She had simply been present. She had answered the call. She had been herself, clearly and completely, in the way that a person who has nothing to hide is simply themselves. The phone call now existed. The conversation existed. The agreement to meet existed. She thought about Shenrui driving home with the boots, running her calculations. She thought about what her sister would do next. Shenrui would call the number back. That was the calculation Shen Qing had already run. There were 2 scenarios. In the first, Shenrui would call the number and discover it was a professional call, not a personal one, and would attempt to insert herself. In the second, she would wait and watch and look for an angle. The first was more likely because Shenrui was constitutionally incapable of watching an opportunity develop without trying to accelerate it. She had always mistaken velocity for strategy. Shen Qing's phone showed no outgoing calls to Hantian's number. Yu Shenrui had not heard the conversation through the door. She had heard only the formal tone, the word absolutely, and the professional register of someone in a meeting. She had known it was not a wrong number. She did not know what it was. She would call. She would find out. She would then, and this was the part that Shen Qing had thought about most carefully, she would find out that the commission was already in progress, that her sister had already spoken to Director Fang Wei, that a visit had been arranged, that the relationship was established, and Shenrui would, because this was Shenrui, look for the gap. She would look for the way in. Not to stop Shen Qing, not directly. Direct confrontation was not her style. She would look for the way to position herself adjacent to the commission, to become relevant, to make herself the person Director Fang Wei remembered when questions arose. She would present herself as a manager, a partner, a representative. She would use the tools she had always used: charm, speed, the performance of competence, and she would attempt to do what she had done in the first life: insert herself between the creator and the client, and become the necessary middle layer. Shen Qing let her. She let Shenrui call Director Fang Wei's office. She let her introduce herself as Shen Qing's business representative, which she discovered when Director Fang Wei's assistant sent her an email noting that her representative had been in touch to schedule a pre-visit call to discuss logistics. Shen Qing wrote back within minutes, "I appreciate the message. For the record, I do not have a business representative, and I have not authorized anyone to contact your office on my behalf. All communications regarding this commission should come directly from me. I apologize for any confusion." She CC'd her own personal email archive, which she had set up specifically to timestamp document all commission correspondence. She did not call her sister. She did not mention it to her sister. She did not, in any conversation over the following 2 weeks, give any indication that she was aware of what Shenrui was doing. She answered her sister's texts about family dinners and their mother's upcoming birthday with the same measured warmth she had always offered. She was present at the family dinner on the following Sunday, ate the dishes her mother had prepared, listened to her father's work stories, watched her sister across the table with the relaxed attention of someone who has already read the last page of a book and is now simply enjoying the structure of how it gets there. Director Fang Wei came to the studio on the following Tuesday. He was 53, compact and precise in the way of people who have spent decades managing complex projects, all with the kind of face that had finished being surprised by most things some time ago. He arrived at 7:15, which was early enough to tell Shen Qing that he valued punctuality above the performance of it. He carried a thermos of his own tea. He watched her work for 4 hours. He did not speak much. He asked occasional questions about the paper, about the ink, about the progression of her grip from character to character. And when she answered, he listened with the specific quality of attention that professionals reserve for the moment when a person stops performing expertise and simply demonstrates it. He looked at the practice sheets she had left on the secondary table, the progression of a character worked through 12 drafts, the marginal notes she wrote in pencil beside each version. At 10:30, he said, "I received an email from you last week?" "Yes," she said. About the person who contacted my office? Yes. He looked at one of the practice sheets for a long moment. Is there anything I should know about that situation? She set down her brush. She considered how to answer. The version of this conversation she had run in her head had included a long explanation, a full account, the kind of testimony that she had spent her first life composing and never delivering. But sitting here, with the early morning light in the studio and the smell of ink and the professional quiet of a man who had just watched her work for 4 hours and knew exactly what he was looking at, she found that the long version was not necessary. Someone has presented my work as theirs before, she said. I want to ensure that doesn't happen here. I've been documenting this project carefully from the beginning. Registration records, process documentation, time-stamped correspondence. Everything. He looked at her. His expression did not change significantly, but something in it settled, the way a room settles when a draft is sealed. Good, he said. That is very good. He picked up his thermos. I'll have the contract drawn up by the end of the week. I want to include a specific clause about authorship verification, a provision requiring you to maintain and provide documentation of the creative process for each scroll. Would you object to that? I'd welcome it, she said. He left at 11. Shenqing stood at the window after he went, watching his car pull out onto the street. The city was fully awake now, ordinary and loud. A bus went past. Someone dropped something metallic on the sidewalk below, and the sound rang up through the glass. She went back to her desk and opened her laptop. She had 14 more pieces to register before the contract arrived. She worked through the afternoon. The contract came on Friday. It was detailed and thorough in the way that contracts produced by institutions with legal departments tend to be: multiple pages of provisions, definitions, schedules of delivery, quality standards, dispute resolution clauses. Shenqing read it 3 times before she signed. The authorship verification clause was there, exactly as discussed, requiring her to maintain documented records of the creative process for each scroll and to provide those records upon request for the lifetime of the commission agreement. The payment terms were structured across 3 tranches: 1/3 upon signing, 1/3 upon delivery of the first 18 scrolls, 1/3 upon final acceptance of all 36. The total, 800,000 yuan. She signed it at her desk with the same brush she used for her practice sheets. She photographed the signed contract immediately, uploaded the photographs to cloud storage, and emailed a copy to herself with the timestamp intact. Then she filed the physical copy in a folder she had labeled, with deliberate plainness, Hantian 2024. She did not tell her sister. She did not tell anyone in her family. She told her grandfather, who said good, and asked when she was starting. She told a single friend, a woman named Yue Qin, who had worked with her as a studio assistant for 3 months 2 years ago, and had left to pursue restoration work. Someone with professional knowledge of calligraphy and a clear, clean relationship to the work that would make her a credible witness if a witness were ever needed. She told her because she asked her to come to the studio twice a week to help with preparation tasks, grinding ink, preparing the paper, the background labor of a large commission, and she wanted that presence documented. This was not technically strategy. Yue Chen was genuinely useful, but the usefulness and the strategic value were not in conflict, which was the best kind of arrangement. She started work on the first scroll in the 2nd week of March. The poem she had chosen to begin with was Du Fu's Spring View, which was perhaps not an obvious choice. It is not among the most technically demanding of the Tang classical canon, but it has a structural compression that rewards a particular kind of brushwork, where the weight of grief is carried in the space between characters rather than in the characters themselves. She had been thinking about that poem for years. She had been thinking about it in a way that only a person who has lost something and recovered it understands. The specific resonance of a poem about loss and persistence written from inside a city under siege. She did not think about these associations while she worked. While she worked, she thought about nothing except the work, the wrist as a river, not a stone. She produced the first scroll in 11 days. It was not fast. It was not supposed to be fast. She documented every session, the photographs, the journal notes, the timestamps. Yue Chen was present for 7 of the 11 sessions, grinding ink, handing materials, making observations in the margins of her own small notebook that she kept without being asked because that was the kind of person Yue Chen was. On the 12th day, Shenrui came to the studio. She came in the way she often came, unannounced, with the breezy entitlement of someone who had never been successfully turned away and had therefore stopped accounting for the possibility. She was wearing a coat that cost more than 3 months of Shenting's studio rent because Shenrui had a talent for money that had nothing to do with earning it directly and everything to do with attaching herself to its gravitational field. She looked at the studio, at the work surfaces, at the single-mounted scroll drying on the hanging rack, with the particular expression of someone taking inventory. "You got a big commission," she said. Not a question. She had known since director Fang Wei's call. She had known for weeks. "I did," Shenqing said. "How big?" Shenqing looked at her sister, at the precise architecture of her face, the practiced ease of her posture, the coat and the rings, and the general presentation of a woman who had learned early that the appearance of having arrived was almost as useful as actually arriving. She had loved her sister once with the uncomplicated love of a child who does not yet understand the difference between family and character. She did not love her with that love anymore. She was not sure what she felt exactly. It was not hatred, because hatred requires a kind of sustained passion. She was no longer interested in directing at Shenrui. It was something more like the feeling you have when you examine a precise mechanism and understand how it works. Detached, complete. "Large enough," she said. "Is it Hantian?" Shenrui said. "Director Feng's project, the museum thing?" Shenqing paused. Not from surprise. The pause was its own kind of communication. The pause of a person who is deciding how much to confirm, which is also the pause of a person who knows more than they're showing. "Where did you hear about that?" she said. Something shifted in Shenrui's face. Not guilt. That was not an emotion her sister experienced with any reliability, but a kind of recalibration, the look of someone who has played a card and is watching to see where it lands. "Oh, you know," she said with the airy vagueness she deployed when she wanted to avoid specifics. "Around?" "I see," Shenqing said. She turned back to her desk. "Do you need anything, or were you just stopping by?" A silence. So, the specific texture of a silence between two people when one of them has said something ordinary and the other knows it is not ordinary. "I thought maybe I could help," Shenrui said. "With the administrative side, contracts, scheduling, client management. You know I'm good at that." "I have it handled," Shenqing said. "Qing, you always say that, because it's always true." Another silence. Shenrui moved slightly, the way she did when she was deciding on a different approach. Not giving up, just repositioning. "The project sounds big, too big to manage alone. The communication alone, keeping a client like Feng Wei informed, managing the delivery schedule." "Rui." Shenqing turned around. She spoke with the pleasant steadiness of someone who has rehearsed nothing, but is also completely certain. "I have a lawyer reviewing my contract. I have an assistant helping in the studio. I have all my documentation in order. I've been doing this for 7 years. I'm fine." So Shenrui looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled. The smile she used when she was placing a marker rather than retreating. "Of course you are," she said. "You're very capable." She picked up her bag. "Tell Mom I'll call her this week." She left. Shenqing stood in the studio, listening to the sound of the door close, and then the sound of the building returning to its ordinary ambient noise. Plumbing, distant traffic, the neighbor's television through the ceiling. She went back to work. Over the next 3 months, she produced 14 more scrolls. The work was the most sustained effort she had committed to in either of her lives. The scale of it required not just technical skill, but a kind of endurance that she had not previously tested, the ability to maintain the specific attentiveness the work demanded across sessions that sometimes ran 6 hours, in a studio that was frequently cold in the early morning and sometimes airless in the late afternoon. She developed a schedule that worked with her body rather than against it. 4 hours of primary work in the morning, documentation and preparation in the early afternoon. Practice sessions in the late afternoon that she used to develop the harder poems in the series, the ones that required more interpretive decisions. Yue Chen came twice a week, ground ink, kept her notes, and occasionally made observations that were useful. A comment about ink density, a question about spacing in a particularly dense passage from Wang Wei that became part of the annotated record of the project. Director Feng Wei's assistant sent monthly check-in emails that Shenqing answered with updates and attached photographs of completed pieces, all time-stamped, all building a correspondence record that was, from a documentary standpoint, exhaustive. She spoke to her lawyer, a quiet, meticulous woman named Attorney Lou, who specialized in intellectual property, so 3 times during this period. Not because she needed immediate legal assistance, but because she wanted Attorney Lou to understand the situation fully enough to move quickly if the situation required it. She explained the history, not her first life, obviously, but the relevant parts of her current preparation. The registration records, the correspondence documentation, the authorship verification clause in the contract, the studio logs. Attorney Lou listened carefully and said, "At the end of the 3rd meeting, if anyone contests your authorship of this work, they would be entering a very well-prepared room." "Good," Shen-Qing said. She paid Attorney Lou's consultation fees from the first tranche of the commission payment, which had arrived the week the contract was signed. The amount made her blink when it appeared in her account. The number felt abstract in the specific way that large numbers do when you have been operating at small scale for a long time. She let herself sit with it for exactly 1 morning, the particular sensation of being compensated at the correct level for the first time. Then she transferred a portion to a business account, paid a quarter's rent in advance on the studio, and purchased a set of brushes that she had been looking at for 2 years. She did not tell her family about the payment amount. She did not tell anyone except Attorney Lou who needed to know, and her bank. Shenrui texted periodically. Cheerful texts, his sister texts, links to articles, questions about family plans, a photograph from their mother's birthday dinner that Shen-Qing had attended and in which she and Shenrui stood side by side with expressions that cameras had recorded as warm. Shen-Qing answered them all. She was friendly and present and gave nothing. She was waiting. She knew approximately what she was waiting for. In her first life, the scroll delivery had been the end of it. Shenrui had delivered the fraudulent works. I collected the payment, and the situation had concluded. The fraud had been successful because it had never been examined. In this life, the situation was different in several specific ways that Shen-Qing had thought about carefully. The authorship verification clause in the contract meant that Director Fang Wei's institution had a legal right to examine and verify the creative process behind the works. The registration records Shen-Qing had built would be compared against any competing claim. And critically, the email Shen-Qing had sent in the early weeks of the commission, the one noting that she had no business representative and had not authorized contact on her behalf, was sitting in Director Fang Wei's institutional correspondence files, time-stamped, creating a specific and searchable record of Shenrui's attempted insertion into the project. She was not waiting for Shenrui to do something. Shenrui had already done everything she was going to do. She had tried to insert herself and been blocked. She had visited the studio and found no leverage. She had positioned herself adjacent to the commission and found no gap. What Shen-Qing was waiting for was the point at which the documentation she had built became active rather than potential. The point at which Director Fang Wei or his legal team or some circumstance of the project's final delivery would cause the prepared structure to bear weight. That point arrived in September. It arrived not in the form she had anticipated, not a direct legal challenge, not a formal complaint, but in the form of a phone call from Director Fang Wei that came at 8 a.m. on a Thursday when she was 3 scrolls from completing the full commission. "Miss Shen," he said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I want you to know I am asking because of a specific situation that has arisen, not because I have any doubt about your work." "Please ask," she said. "Someone has approached a member of my board and claimed to be the primary creative force behind this commission. They've said that they were the original contact person for this project, that they managed the creative direction, and that the work is—" a very brief pause, the pause of a man choosing the precise word, "substantially theirs." Shen-Qing sat with the phone against her ear. The studio was quiet. Through the window, the September morning was doing the things September mornings do in the north. The specific gold-blue quality of light that is beautiful and slightly melancholy simultaneously. "I see," she said. "I want to be clear that this claim was made to a board member, not through any official channel. My legal team has flagged it. Before we proceed formally, I wanted to speak with you." "I appreciate that," she said. "What do you need from me?" "Everything," he said. "Every piece of documentation you have. Registration records, process documentation, correspondence, studio logs, everything your authorship verification clause covers. She was already pulling open the folder on her laptop. "I can send it all today," she said. "I've been maintaining records from the first day of the commission. The China Copyright Protection Center registration records go back further than that. I began registering representative portfolio works 6 months ago. I also have a studio assistant who can provide testimony regarding her presence during the creation of the commissioned works, and an intellectual property attorney who has been briefed on the situation." A pause on Director Fang Wei's end. "Miss Shen," he said slowly, "how long have you been preparing for this specific situation?" She thought about what to say. She thought about the studio floor at 6 a.m., the gray-pink sky, the smell of ink, the phone reach. She thought about what a person can know and cannot explain. "I've dealt with this kind of thing before," she said. "I made sure I was protected this time." She heard something in his exhale. Not quite a laugh, but the sound of a person who is relieved in the specific way that relief sounds when it comes after sustained professional anxiety. "Send everything," he said. "I'll have my legal team contact you today." She did. By noon, she had sent 11 organized document folders, registration certificates, and filing confirmations from the Copyright Protection Center, the complete studio log dating from the first day of work. 847 individual dated photographs, documenting the creation process of each scroll from blank paper to completion. The full email correspondence with Hantian's office, including the email she had sent early in the commission, clarifying that she had no business representative. Her correspondence with Attorney Liu, and UHN's written record of her studio visits, signed and dated. The legal team called her at 2:30. They were efficient and specific in the way that institutional legal teams are when they have already made a preliminary assessment and are now gathering confirmation rather than investigating. They asked her to clarify the timeline of certain events. They asked about the nature of her relationship with the person who had made the competing claim. She answered each question without embellishment and without evasion. She did not name her sister. She answered what was asked. At 4:15, Attorney Liu called. "Hantian's legal team just reached out to me," she said. "They're very interested in the documentation package. They're also interested in whether you intend to pursue any independent claim against the individual who made the competing assertion." "What would that look like?" Shenting asked. "It depends on what the individual actually did. If she presented your portfolio to the client as her own work and attempted to position herself as the commission holder," Attorney Liu paused, "that could constitute fraud and copyright infringement independently of whatever Hantian chooses to pursue. The fact that Hantian has a prior record of her unauthorized contact with their office, combined with your documentation package, creates a fairly specific picture." Shenting was quiet for a moment. "Let Hantian lead," she said. "I'll follow if it makes sense. Right now I want to finish the commission." "Understood," Attorney Liu said. "But start keeping records of any contact with the individual in question. Anything she says to you, any messages, any visits." "I already am," Shenqing said. She had been since February. She returned to her desk. She had 3 scrolls left. She had 3 days of work left, approximately. And if she did not rush and did not fall short of the standards she'd been holding for 7 months, she picked up the brush, the wrist as a river, not a stone. She finished the commission on the last Sunday of September, producing the final scroll, a rendering of Li Bai's Quiet Night Thought, the most widely known poem in the classical canon, which she had saved deliberately for last precisely because of its familiarity. Because completing it required her to find something in a well-known text that was specifically hers, that could not be mistaken for anyone else's. At 3:47 p.m., with the afternoon light coming through the window at the specific angle that meant the day was beginning to leave, she photographed the final scroll. She updated the studio log. She sent Director Fang Wei an email. "The final scroll has been completed today. I am ready to arrange delivery at your convenience," he replied within 20 minutes. "Excellent. We'll schedule for this week. I also want to inform you that our legal team has formally initiated contact with the individual who made the competing claim. You'll receive official correspondence regarding your own options shortly." She read the email twice. Then she closed her laptop. She made tea. She stood at the window and drank it. No, the city below was doing its ordinary Sunday afternoon thing. People with bags, a couple arguing about nothing important, a child riding a bicycle with 2 small wheels along the pavement, while an adult jogged alongside making small adjustments to the child's balance. Her phone showed 4 texts from Shen Rui in the past 48 hours. She had not answered them. They ranged in tone from breezy to slightly strained. The progression of a person who has sent something into a void and is beginning to understand the void is intentional. She did not answer them now either. The delivery was arranged for Wednesday. Director Fang Wei came himself, with 2 staff members and a conservator who examined each scroll with the specific physical attention of someone who works with historical documents, holding it at precise angles, examining the paper, the ink layering, the consistency of the brushwork. The conservator made notes in a small book and said nothing to Shenqing directly until the examination of the 12th scroll, when she looked up and said, "This is the work of someone who has been doing this for a very long time." "Since I was 7, Shenqing said. The conservator looked at the scroll again. "The Tang Poetry series in the new museum wing," she said, "from the previous project. I examined those too. Different work. Substantially different." "Yes," Shenqing said. "It would be." Director Fang Wei, who had heard this exchange, said nothing. He looked at the conservator. The conservator returned to her notes. All 36 scrolls were accepted. The final payment tranche was processed within the week. When it cleared and the full amount sat in her account, all 800,000 yuan, minus the portions already received. She sat at her desk in the studio and looked at the number for a long time, not with triumph. Not even with particular satisfaction, with the specific sobriety of a person who has completed something that cost more than money. Hantian Cultural Heritage Foundation's legal action was formally initiated in October. Shenqing learned the details through attorney Liu, who received copies of the relevant correspondence. The suit named Shen Rui for fraudulent misrepresentation, specifically the claim to a board member that she had been the primary creative force behind a commissioned work, accompanied by the presentation of materials she had not created. Hantian's legal team had assembled a document package that drew substantially from the records Shenqing had provided, the registration records, the studio logs, the correspondence, combined with their own institutional records, including the early email in which Shenqing had clarified she had no business representative. The damages sought were specific and substantial. They included the value of any reputational harm suffered by the institution as a result of the false claim, the legal costs associated with verifying the commission's authenticity once the claim was made, and the costs of the conservator's examination. The total figure was not the most dramatic element of the suit. What was most dramatic from a legal standpoint was the specificity of the copyright violation documentation, the fact that Shenqing's authorship was not just asserted but proven. Layer by layer, in a documentation package so thorough that challenging it would require disputing time-stamped registration records, dated cloud-stored photographs, a witness's written account, institutional correspondence, and an attorney's briefing file simultaneously. Attorney Liu sent her a summary with the note, "This is what a prepared case looks like. They'll settle." Shenqing's phone showed 7 missed calls from her sister across 2 days. Then 3 text messages that moved from the breezy tone into something more urgent, then into a register she had only heard from Shen Rui twice before, stripped of performance, slightly frantic. The last one read, "Qing, I need to talk to you." She read it. She thought about her first life, the years of not knowing, the descent into small work and smaller circumstances, the sold brushes, the studio that smelled of nothing. She thought about what answer Shen Rui deserved. She replied, "Talk to your lawyer." She put the phone face down on the desk and went back to work. There was already a second project forming. Director Fang Wei had called 2 days after the formal delivery to ask whether she would be interested in a follow-on commission, not for the museum, but for a private collection. A man named Chen, who had seen photographs of the Tang series and had begun a conversation with Director Fang Wei about a comparable project for his estate library. The scope was similar, the nature was different. Where the museum commission required the restraint of a work that would hang in a public institution, this commission apparently invited more interpretive latitude, more presence in the brushwork, the collector's preference being for something that retained the classical foundation but moved it into a more personal register. Director Fang Wei named a fee. He mentioned that it was standard for a project of this scale. Shenqing said, "I'll need more than standard." A pause, not surprised exactly, but recalibrating. The pause of a person updating their model. "How much more?" he said. 2.5 million, she said. The number she had calculated was based on the scope, the timeline, the interpretive latitude required, and the market rate for a commission of this nature with her demonstrated portfolio. It was not an aggressive number. It was the correct number. Another pause. The collector is accustomed to paying for quality, Director Fangwei said carefully. I'm accustomed to being paid for it, she said. A third pause, shorter. I'll speak with him and call you back this week. He called back on Thursday. He wants to meet you, he said, and he's agreed to the $2.5 million with one additional condition, which is, he wants the same documentation structure you used for the museum commission. Whoa, the full process record. That's not a condition, she said. That's how I work now. Director Fangwei made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then I think this will go well, he said. She hung up and looked at the studio. The hanging rack, the empty surfaces where the 36 scrolls had been, the brushes in their holder, the morning light doing the particular thing it did when the air had changed from summer to autumn, the smell of ink, not abstract, specific, mineral, slightly sweet. It old in the way that things are old when they have absorbed time. She got up and began preparing the paper. The law, at its most useful, is not a weapon. It is a structure. The mistake most people make when they are wronged is to look for a weapon, something to strike with, something with immediate visible impact, something that creates a confrontation you can feel and witness and point to as the moment when things changed. Weapons require timing, proximity, the willingness to absorb impact yourself. Weapons often miss. Structures do not miss. Structures simply are. And when a person who has committed a wrong encounters the structure that was already there, waiting, the impact is not dramatic. It is simply the impact of reality refusing to accommodate fiction. Shunqing had not built a trap. She had built a record. A true record of what was actually true. He's assembled with enough precision and depth that no competing version could stand adjacent to it without being immediately visible as lesser, as thinner, as the work of someone who had only ever photographed the surface of a thing and mistaken that for knowing it. The commission was real. The work was real. The documentation was real. And because all of it was real, the structure of it was permanent in the way that real things are permanent. Not invulnerable, nothing is invulnerable, but coherent, consistent, impossible to dismantle without disassembling the fundamental evidence of what had actually happened and when. Shenrui's claim had been a claim about the surface of something. It had had no interior. It had looked from a certain angle in certain light, like the real thing. The way a photograph of a calligraphy scroll looks like the scroll itself when you do not know what the paper feels like, what the ink layers look like under close examination. What the precise variation in brush pressure means about who was holding the brush and what they understood. The conservator had known at the 12th scroll. The legal team had known at the first folder of documentation. What Shenrui had not understood, what she had perhaps never understood about the work her sister did, was that calligraphy is not a product. It is not something you can outsource and then present as yours, not if you intend the deception to hold up to any real examination. Because the work carries the body of the person who made it in a way that cannot be replicated by someone who has only seen photographs. The pressure, the proportion, the decision about how long to let a stroke move before lifting, these are things a human body learns over years and carries in its muscles and its memory and its reflexive response to the particular resistance of paper and ink, and they are things that leave specific marks, marks as individual as fingerprints. Marks that a person like the conservator, who had examined historical documents for 20 years, could read as immediately as a face. The deception had held in the first life because no one had looked. No one had been given reason to look. The structure of institutions, cultural foundations, museum boards, the administrative machinery of major public projects tends to accept what is presented to it. Particularly when what is presented moves with confidence and produces something that is close enough. The examination only happens when someone makes it necessary. When someone creates the conditions under which examination becomes unavoidable. Shunqing had created those conditions, not through accusation, through presence. She had simply been real, in a documented, verifiable, time-stamped, registered way that made any competing version of reality immediately comparative. She had been so thoroughly herself, so specifically, evidentially, legally herself, that there was no gap for anything else to occupy. The ground had been built before the commission began. By the time the commission ended, anyone trying to claim the territory was standing on nothing. She worked through October on the preliminary studies for the new commission. The collector, Chen, a man who apparently collected silence the way some people collect art, and whose estate library housed 3 walls of classical texts in mint condition that he had inherited and spent 40 years carefully not allowing to be photographed by anyone, had met with her once, briefly, in a room that smelled of old paper and cedar and the particular absence of sound that only deep interior spaces have. He had looked at 3 of her practice pieces for approximately 8 minutes, said nothing, and then looked at her and said, "So when can you start?" "I already have," she said. He had looked at her differently after that. Not warmer exactly. Warmth did not seem to be his register, but with the specific attention of someone who has recognized a quality they were not certain they would find. She would begin the formal commission work in November. The documentation structure was already in place. The Copyright Protection Center had her portfolio on file. Attorney Liu had her briefed. The studio was prepared. She ordered new brushes, not a replacement set, but an expansion. A range she had not been able to justify previously, tools that the scale and ambition of the new work now made appropriate. They arrived in a wooden box lined with cloth. She unwrapped each one with the attention she had learned to give to things that would be used to make something real. Outside the studio, October was doing what October does, stripping the trees down to their actual shapes, removing all the decorative growth that summer allows, leaving only the permanent structure visible. Cold in the mornings, the specific smell of turned earth and fallen leaves that urban spaces have in autumn, reaching up through traffic and concrete to insist on the older thing below. Her grandfather called on a Thursday evening. "I heard from your Auntie Zhao," he said. "She mentioned your sister has some legal trouble?" "Yes," Shenqing said. A long pause, not uncomfortable. The kind of pause a person takes when they are deciding not to say several things and are choosing the one they will say. "Did you have anything to do with it?" he said, not an accusation. A question from a man who had watched her since she was 7 and knew the difference between the things that happen to a person and the things a person makes happen. "She made the choices she made," Shenqing said. "I just made sure there was a record." Another pause. "Well, your brushwork on those Tang pieces was very good," he said. "The photograph director Fang Wei sent me. Very good." "You saw it?" "He called to tell me about his conservator's notes," her grandfather said. "He wanted to know about your training." She sat with that for a moment. The image of director Fang Wei, the precise and formal director of a cultural foundation, calling an elderly man in an ink-soaked apartment to discuss her brushwork. There was something in it that was very close to what other people called gratifying, but which she experienced as simply correct, as the specific sensation of a thing being where it belongs. "What did you tell him?" she said. "The truth," her grandfather said. "That you started when you were 7, that your wrist was wrong for 3 years, that you corrected it yourself without being told. Oh, and that you've been the best student I've ever had since you were 14. She said nothing for a moment. "Grandfather?" "What?" "Thank you." "For telling the truth?" He made a sound that was not quite dismissive. "That's not something you thank a person for. That's just how you speak." He hung up. Shenqing sat with the phone in her lap, in the dark studio. She had not turned on the overhead light as the afternoon faded. He had simply let the room move into its evening state, and was quiet for a while. The legal proceedings involving Shenrui moved with the slow but irreversible momentum of formal institutional processes. Attorney Liu sent periodic updates. A settlement conversation had been initiated. The numbers being discussed were not small. Separately, and this was the part Attorney Liu flagged with particular attention, the detailed examination of Shenrui's previous commission contact, including the circumstances under which she had apparently made contact with Director Fang Wei's office in the weeks prior to Shenqing's own commission, had opened an inquiry into the earlier project, the Museum Wing Project, the project from before. This was not something Shenqing had anticipated, or rather, she had anticipated the possibility, but had not expected it to surface so quickly. The conservator's comment at the delivery about the previous project's work being substantially different had apparently prompted internal discussion. The institutional memory of that earlier project, the contract records, the delivery records, the works themselves, which were hanging in a national museum, was accessible examinable. Attorney Liu said, "This may go further than the current commission dispute." "I know," Shunqing said. "Do you want to be involved in that separately?" She thought about it. She thought about the first life, the years of accumulating understanding of what had been taken, the obsessive research into copyright law that she had done too late to use. She thought about the brushes she had sold, the studio that smelled of nothing. "Yes," she said, "but let them lead. I'll provide whatever documentation they need." "Your portfolio registration records from February would be relevant," Attorney Liu said. "They predate the formal commission agreement. They establish your style as a documented body of work before the current project began." "I know," Shunqing said. "That's why I filed them then." A brief silence on Attorney Liu's end. "How much of this did you plan in advance?" she said. "Enough," Shunqing said. November arrived in the way November does. Not dramatically, not with the sharp theatrics of the seasonal change, but with the steady, the patient dimming of available light that eventually becomes simply the condition of the world for several months. She started the new commission in the first week, worked mornings, documented everything. The collector, Chen, had provided a list of poems he wanted considered for the series, 93 poems across 8 classical poets, from which she was to select 30 and develop the series structure. She read them over several days, making notes, feeling the weight of the language against the developing sense of how the work should move. She was selecting them one morning, physically writing each chosen title in her journal, annotating her reasons, the kind of detailed decision record that now felt as natural as breathing because she had been building it for months, when her phone showed Shenrui's name. She looked at it. She let it ring. It rang 7 times before going to voicemail. She did not listen to the voicemail. She wrote it in her journal. Date, time, missed call, Shenrui. She went back to the poems. There was a specific one she kept returning to. Wang Chongling's Lotus-Picking Girl, brief and imagistic, the kind of poem that most people read for its surface prettiness, and whose particular compression and internal movement only becomes visible when you have read it enough times to stop hearing it as beautiful and start hearing it as precise. There is a figure in that poem who appears in a single line, barely described, and whose presence restructures the entire visual field of the poem around them. The technique is so minimal that most readers don't notice it, but it creates the effect of suddenly understanding that the frame of what you're looking at has always been larger than you assumed. She added it to the selected 30. The legal proceedings concluded, as Attorney Liu had predicted, in a settlement rather than a verdict. Shenrui agreeing to the terms rather than contesting them at trial, which was the rational choice when the documentation facing her was as complete as it was. The specific terms were not disclosed publicly, which was part of the settlement agreement. What Shunqing knew from Attorney Liu was that the settlement sum was significant, that the formal acknowledgement of rights included in the terms was binding, and that the separate inquiry into the earlier project had not concluded and would likely require additional time. She did not feel what she had expected to feel when the settlement was confirmed. She had expected something, not celebration. She was not built for celebration, but some version of the specific satisfaction that comes when a mechanism you have constructed performs its intended function. She felt something, but it was quieter than expected. More like the feeling at the end of a long session when the work has been good. A certain quietness, a certain sense of completion that is also the sense of something having been put down, something that had weight. She called her grandfather and told him the settlement had been reached. "Good," he said. "Is that all you're going to say?" "What else is there to say?" he said. It was correct. Correct things don't need a speech. She had a meeting with Collector Chen the following week. He in his library, where she presented the selected 30 poems with her full annotation of the selection rationale and the developing structural plan for the series. He sat across from her at a table made of something very old and very expensive and listened to her describe each selection with the particular quality of attention she was beginning to associate with him, deep and unhurried. The attention of someone who has learned to take things at the pace they demand rather than the pace he preferred. At the end of the presentation, he said, "The Lotus-Picking Girl." "Yes," she said. "The figure in the 5th line," he said, "who doesn't speak." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "Most people miss that," he said. Most people are looking at the surface, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'd like to add a condition to the commission. He named a number, not an additional fee, an adjustment upward, an increase of 500,000 yuan to the agreed total. She waited. I want you to give a lecture, he said, to my foundation's annual gathering. About this work, about the selection process, about whatever you think is worth saying. He looked at the annotation pages in front of him. You think in a way that should be heard. She looked at him, at the library around him, and the 3 walls of classical texts that had not been photographed in 40 years. The cedar smell, the paper smell, the specific quality of silence in a room that has been used for serious attention for a long time. I'll need to think about what to say, she said. Take the winter, he said. The gathering is in spring. She drove home through the November city, all amber and gray, all the warmth behind glass. The studio would be cold when she arrived. She would turn on the small heater she kept next to the desk and make tea and let the space warm up before she began the evening's work, studying the poems she had selected, making the preliminary decisions about structure and sequence that would eventually become the brushwork itself. The work had not changed. The work was what it had always been. The difference was that she was now, finally, at the center of it. Not adjacent to it, not dependent on someone else's willingness to see it. So not operating in the gap between her own capability and the world's acknowledgement of it, hoping the gap would close on its own. She had closed it herself, not with confrontation, not with exposure, with the most ordinary materials available to anyone who understands that creation leaves evidence, a registration form, a photograph, a journal entry, an email, a date, a time, the specific and verifiable record of a thing that was made by a specific person at a specific moment in time and could be proven to have been so. She parked outside the studio building and sat in the car for a moment before going in. The street was quiet in the way city streets are quiet at the precise threshold between the day's business and its aftermath, a brief stillness, a held breath, before the evening traffic thickened again. Oh, she had 3 months of winter and 30 poems and the beginning of something that was, for the first time, entirely and provably hers. She got out of the car and went upstairs. She turned on the heater. She filled the kettle. She opened her journal to the next blank page and picked up a pen, and at the top of the page she wrote the date in characters that were practiced and precise and unmistakably hers. Then she began. Director Fang Wei's call came on a Tuesday in December, when the commission work was well underway and Shenting had settled into the particular rhythm of deep project work, the kind of work that makes the days feel short and the weeks feel significant. He called at 9 a.m. and she answered at her desk, brush set aside, the smell of morning ink in the air. I wanted to call personally, he said. The inquiry into the earlier project has reached a preliminary finding. She waited. The works in the museum wing are going to be re-examined by an independent conservator panel. The documentation you provided, the portfolio registration records from February, the studio logs, the style analysis, has been submitted as part of the evidentiary package. A pause. I want to say something to you. Please, she said. When I first saw your studio, he said, I knew, before we even discussed the project formally, I've worked with calligraphers for 20 years, and I knew from watching you work for 40 minutes that you were someone whose work I could not afford to lose to a bad situation. Another pause, shorter. I'm sorry it took this long. She looked at the practice sheet on her desk, a character she had been working on the previous evening. A single character worked through 11 drafts in search of the exact quality she wanted. It didn't take as long as it might have, she said. He made a sound that was, she thought, the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him. The museum commission, he said, when the re-examination is complete, if the finding is what the preliminary evidence suggests it will be, the institution will be in a position to commission replacement works, works that are correctly attributed, correctly documented, correctly produced. A pause. I'd like that to be you. She was quiet for a moment. How many scrolls? She said. 36, he said. The same series. Tang classical poetry. The institution would want to maintain the thematic coherence of the wing. She looked at the November light on her desk, at the character she had worked through 11 drafts, at the brush she had set aside to take the call. The fee, she said, for a commission of that nature for a national museum in the context of the documentation of what happened previously and the institutional significance of the correction, triple. He said, "We anticipated that." The board has already approved the figure. She did not say anything for a moment. "Send me the preliminary framework," she said. "I'll review it with my attorney." "Of course," he said. "Miss Shen—" A brief pause. "Thank you for how you handled this. All of it." She looked at the ink drying on the practice sheet. "Thank you for looking closely enough to see it," she said. She set the phone down and picked up her brush.